In the spring of 2014, South Korea was thriving. The nation stood proud of its technology, its economy, its modern infrastructure. But beneath that progress, hidden weaknesses remained, weaknesses that would soon erupt into one of the darkest maritime disasters in the country's history. To understand the tragedy of April 16, 2014, we must first understand the ship itself. The ferry Sewol was not born in Korea. It was built in Japan in 1994, and for nearly 20 years it served faithfully there. But by 2012, time had caught up with the vessel. Its Japanese owners sold it. Geun-hye Marine, a South Korean company, stepped in. They purchased the aging ship, and soon after they modified it. Cabins were added, decks extended, passenger capacity increased to nearly 1,000. But with every addition came risk. Experts would later warn, these changes made the Sewol dangerously unstable, top-heavy, a vessel waiting for disaster. On March 15, 2013, the Sewol officially began its new service, sailing between the busy port of Incheon and Jeju Island. Jeju, known as the Hawaii of the East, a volcanic island of beaches, cliffs, and emerald seas. It was a place of romance for newlyweds, a paradise for tourists, and for students across the nation, a rite of passage. Every year, schools sent their teenagers to Jeju for study trips. 4 days of exploration, 4 days of memories. For the students of Donwon High School in Ansan, 2014 was their turn. 325 bright-eyed students, most only 16 or 17 years old, packed their bags. Teachers and chaperones accompanied them. The excitement was overwhelming. For many, this would be the first time leaving home without their parents. April 15, 2014, the students gathered at Incheon Port. Their original plan was to board another ship, the Oham, but that morning a heavy fog blanketed the sea. Authorities grounded several vessels. Time slipped by, and the students grew restless. Finally, clearance came. The Sewol would sail, and the Donwon students were moved onto this ferry. Their adventure to Jeju had begun. On that night, the atmosphere on board was electric. On the 4th deck, students laughed and sang, trading snacks and stories. Teachers, housed 1 floor above, gathered to celebrate a colleague's birthday with cake, music, and joy. On the 3rd deck, ordinary passengers settled into their own routines. Below them, in the cargo hold, dozens of vehicles and containers were stacked high. Too high. Investigators would later uncover that the Sewol carried far more cargo than regulations allowed, and that much of it was poorly secured, a silent danger, hidden beneath the surface. But the teenagers of Donwon knew nothing of this. In their cabins, they played games, planned performances, and whispered about the adventures that awaited on Jeju Island. Their laughter echoed in the hallways. Their cameras captured smiles. The last smiles some of them would ever record. Outside, the sea was calm. The engines hummed steadily. The Sewol cut through the night, a lone vessel on a dark horizon. For those on board, everything felt ordinary, safe. No one could imagine that within 12 hours, their journey would transform into a national nightmare. This was the beginning of the Sewol tragedy. Dawn broke quietly on April 16, 2014. The Sewol glided through calm waters off the southwestern coast of South Korea. To the students on board, it was just another morning, another step closer to Jeju Island. On the 4th deck, Teenagers stirred awake. Some scrolled through their phones, sending cheerful messages to family and friends. Others gathered in hallways, laughing, trading snacks, snapping photos. Their world was filled with anticipation. But beneath their feet, something was wrong. The Sewol was overloaded with cargo, trucks and shipping containers stacked and tied down improperly, shifted as the ferry turned. Every degree of movement pushed the vessel closer to imbalance. At 8:48 a.m., it happened. A violent shudder ran through the ship. Passengers felt the floor lurch beneath them. Containers tumbled overboard. The entire vessel began to tilt, 30 degrees within seconds. In one of the cabins, a student named Geun-hye grabbed his phone. Without hesitation, he dialed South Korea's emergency hotline, 119. His call came before any crew member even radioed for help. Think about that. A 17-year-old student calling for rescue before trained sailors. Minutes later, the crew finally sent out a distress signal. The message was clear. The ferry was sinking. On board, panic was just beginning to spread. The ship's intercom crackled to life. A voice ordered passengers to remain where they were. Stay put. Do not move. For many, especially the students, this instruction carried weight. They trusted authority. Teachers had drilled obedience into them from their earliest years. If the captain and crew told them to stay, then staying must be the safest choice. At 9:13 a.m., the angle worsened, over 50 degrees. Passengers struggled to stand, hallways tilted into walls, furniture slid across rooms. Water began seeping into the lower decks. Still, the announcements continued. Remain in your cabins. Do not attempt to escape. Some obeyed. They sat on the floors of their cabins, waiting. Others began to cry, clutching phones, calling parents, whispering fears. Many recorded videos, their voices trembling yet still calm, because they believed rescue was coming. Meanwhile, outside the ferry, the first responders scrambled. The Coast Guard dispatched patrol boats. Helicopters lifted off from bases onshore. But the response was uncoordinated, fragmented. Time slipped away. And with every passing minute, the Sewol leaned further into the sea. By now, local fishing boats and private... And inside the doomed ferry, another betrayal unfolded. The first people to abandon ship were not the passengers, but the crew themselves. Officers and sailors, including the captain, were seen climbing into rescue boats. They left while hundreds of students remained trapped in their cabins, faithfully following the order to stay put. One by one, hope began to erode. On the fourth deck, students clung to door frames. On the third deck, seawater surged through hallways. The tilt grew so steep that standing was nearly impossible. Fear turned to terror. Still, many of the young passengers held on to their phones. They sent desperate messages home, texts that read, "Mom, don't worry, I'm wearing a life jacket," or, "Dad, this might be my last chance to say goodbye." Outside, the Sewol was now visibly sinking. From a distance, witnesses saw the ferry leaning sharply, its white hull slipping deeper beneath the waves. Yet the full scale of the disaster was still unclear to those watching from shore. Inside the ship, the students of Donwon High School were running out of time. By 9:30 a.m. on April 16, 2014, the Sewol was in mortal danger. The once stable ferry was now leaning at an impossible angle. Hallways became walls, ceilings turned into floors. Passengers clung desperately to whatever they could grasp. On the fourth deck, the students of Donwon High School tried to remain calm. Some pressed life jackets over their uniforms. Others huddled together in corners, whispering prayers, holding hands. They had been told to stay put, and so they waited. But water does not wait. It surged into the lower levels, flooding the third deck first. Vehicles and cargo broke loose, crashing against walls with terrifying force. Metal groaned. The ship shuddered, as if fighting its own death. At 9:45 a.m., the tilt reached more than 60 degrees. Passengers who tried to move found themselves sliding downward, trapped against walls or pinned beneath debris. The ferry was becoming a cage. Above deck, the crew, those who had not already fled, still offered no clear evacuation order. Helicopters hovered overhead, but rescue baskets lowered only sporadically. Civilian fishing boats floated nearby, waiting, begging to help, but receiving no direction. And then, betrayal deepened. The captain, Lee Jun-sok, abandoned ship. Dressed in civilian clothes, he climbed into a lifeboat, leaving behind hundreds of teenagers. The very man sworn to protect his passengers was among the first to flee. Inside the cabins, fear had turned into resignation. Phones buzzed with last messages. Students called their parents, their voices trembling. "Dad, I don't know what's happening, but I think this is the end. Mom, I love you." Some recorded videos. In them, laughter still mingled with fear, a nervous laughter, the sound of children trying to mask their terror. Those recordings would later become evidence, a haunting window into their final moments. At 10 a.m., the Sewol was on its side. Passengers who had ignored the order to stay put, who had scrambled up stairwells or smashed windows, now had a chance. A handful leapt into the sea, clinging to rescue ropes, swimming toward nearby boats. Among them was a student, Park Geun-hye, who would become the last known survivor from inside the ferry. But for most, escape. Witnesses on nearby vessels watched in horror. The Sewol's white body, once proud and upright, now lay almost flat against the sea. People screamed from its tilted decks, and then, slowly, the ship began to slip beneath the surface. At 10:21 a.m., the ferry capsized completely. Only the underbelly of the hull remained visible, jutting out of the water like a gravestone. Within minutes, even that began to vanish. The students, trapped inside, made their final calls during those moments. Parents on shore listened helplessly as voices faded, replaced by silence. By 10:30 a.m., the Sewol was gone. What had begun as a joyous school trip had ended in catastrophe. Hundreds of lives were lost within less than 2 hours. But the true tragedy was not only in the sinking itself. It was in the decisions made, the orders to stay put, the abandonment by the crew, and the failed rescue response that could have saved so many more. For the families waiting on land, News was slow, confusing, and often misleading. At first, officials announced that everyone had been rescued. Relief spread among the parents. But hours later, the truth emerged. Their children were gone. The Sewol disaster was no longer just a maritime accident. It was a national trauma, a wound that would cut deep into South Korea's heart. When news of the Sewol's distress first reached the mainland, chaos followed. At 9 a.m., broadcasters aired reports that a ferry was tilting in the waters near Jindo, but details were scattered, contradictory, and often dangerously wrong. At 11 a.m., the government's disaster response headquarters made an announcement. All passengers have been rescued. Relief rippled across South Korea. Parents of Donwon High School students gathered in the gymnasium of their school cheered, clapping and embracing one another. But it was a lie. In reality, the majority of the passengers were still trapped inside the sunken ferry. The supposed rescue was nothing more than a miscalculation, a tragic error repeated across live news. Hours would pass before the truth began to seep out. Meanwhile, on the sea, the so-called rescue effort was faltering. The Coast Guard's boats circled the wreck. Helicopters hovered, lowering ropes to a handful of passengers stranded on the exposed hull. But no large-scale evacuation had been attempted before the ferry disappeared beneath the water. Civilian divers and fishing boats, those who rushed in on instinct, pleaded to help. Many were locals familiar with the waters of Jindo, but bureaucracy and confusion kept them waiting. No unified command existed. Every minute lost was another life drowned below. As time passed, the scene became unbearable. Parents, desperate and frantic, drove down to Jindo themselves. The gymnasium on the island became a gathering ground for hundreds of families. They waited, clutching their phones, staring at televisions, begging for updates. And then the report shifted. The all-rescued announcement was quietly corrected. Officials now admitted most passengers were still missing. Hope dissolved into rage and fear. Parents screamed at the authorities, demanding to know why their children had not been saved. Back at sea, divers faced impossible conditions. The Sewol lay on its side, currents surging around it, waters dark and filled with debris. Every attempt to penetrate the cabins was a fight against time. Inside, oxygen was running out. Survivors, if any remained, were minutes from suffocating. But the orders from above were hesitant, inconsistent. Rescue operations stalled for hours. Political leaders visited the site, their presence more ceremonial than practical. Bureaucracy strangled urgency. One image captured the nation's fury. President Park Geun-hye, standing before cameras, declaring that the Coast Guard and military were doing everything possible. But to the families watching, those words rang hollow. Their children were still trapped underwater, while officials gave speeches. As the first recovered bodies surfaced, hope turned into horror. Parents in Jindo lined up outside makeshift morgues, waiting for their child's name to be called. The gymnasium that had echoed with cheers earlier now filled with wails of grief. Some parents fainted. Others collapsed to the ground, pounding the floor with their fists. The betrayal was unbearable. Not only had their children died, but they had been misled, told to believe in a rescue that never came. By nightfall on April 16th, the Sewol lay silent beneath the waves. The frantic rescue effort had recovered only a small fraction of those on board. Out of more than 470 passengers, fewer than 180 were saved. The rest, mostly students, remained entombed in the ferry. The nation demanded answers. How could this happen? Why were passengers told to stay inside? Why did the crew abandon ship? Why did the government spread false information? These questions would ignite a firestorm in South Korea, one that would not only reshape public trust, but also topple a president. The sinking of the Sewol was no longer just a maritime disaster. It had become a symbol of systemic failure, of negligence at every level, and of the devastating cost of misplaced trust. By the evening of April 16, 2014, the Sewol had vanished beneath the sea. For the families, hope turned to dread, and soon, dread gave way to grief. In Jindo's gymnasium, parents sat in rows of plastic chairs, eyes fixed on television screens that replayed the sinking over and over. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by sudden cries when another list of recovered names was read aloud. The bodies began arriving. Divers, risking the currents, brought them up one by one. Each recovery was announced by loudspeaker. Parents rushed forward, desperate for a glimpse, terrified of recognition. When they saw their child's name, some collapsed instantly. Others screamed until their voices broke. Inside the gymnasium, grief was raw, unfiltered. Mothers clawed at the floor. Fathers punched the walls in fury. The pain was unbearable because this was not just an accident. To the parents, it was betrayal. Their children had trusted authority, obeyed instructions, and paid with their lives. Across South Korea, the entire nation stopped. Schools held moments of silence. Newspapers printed black borders around their front pages. Television anchors broke down mid-broadcast. Everyone, from the bustling streets of Seoul to the quiet villages of Jeju, felt the weight of the disaster. And then came the anger. Citizens demanded to know why so many young lives had been lost when rescue had seemed possible. Candlelight vigils spread across the country. People carried yellow ribbons, symbols of remembrance, symbols of rage. Placards read, "We want the truth." Meanwhile, divers continued their grim work. For weeks they entered the wreck, inch by inch, pulling bodies from the flooded cabins. The conditions were brutal. Water pressure crushed lungs. Visibility was near zero. Some divers suffered decompression sickness. At least 2 lost their lives in the effort. Inside the ferry, the scenes were heartbreaking. Students were found clustered together in groups, friends holding hands in their final moments. Teachers were discovered beside their students, still trying to shield them from the water. Life jackets, backpacks, and notebooks floated among the debris. Families were forced to wait. Each day brought only a handful of recoveries. Some parents camped outside the harbor, staring into the ocean, refusing to leave until their children were returned. Others lived in the gymnasium for weeks, sleeping on thin mats, surviving on donated food, consumed by grief and exhaustion. By May, nearly all of the missing had been found. In total, 304 lives were lost. Among them, 250 were students from Donwon High School. The final list confirmed what parents had already feared. Almost an entire grade of teenagers had been wiped out in a single morning. Funerals swept across South Korea. Coffins lined gymnasiums, schools, and city halls. Portraits of young faces, smiling in school uniforms, were framed with black ribbons. Entire neighborhoods wept as processions passed by. And yet, alongside the mourning, one word echoed again and again. Why? Why had the crew told students to stay put? Why had the captain abandoned ship? Why had the Coast Guard failed to act swiftly? Why had the government misled the public? The grief turned into fury. Families of victims began organizing. They demanded investigations, accountability, and justice. Their voices, once filled with sobs, now carried sharp determination. The Sewol disaster was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was becoming a national reckoning. South Korea had lost its children. Now it demanded the truth about why. In the months after the Sewol sank, grief turned into fury. The families of victims refused to stay silent. They demanded accountability, not just from the captain and crew, but from every official whose failures had cost hundreds of lives. Investigations began almost immediately, and what they uncovered was devastating. The Sewol had been dangerously unstable long before April 16th. Originally built in Japan in 1994, it was later purchased by a South Korean company, Geun-hye Marine. In order to carry more cargo, the ship was illegally modified. Extra cabins were added. Safety limits were ignored. And regulators, either blind or complicit, approved it anyway. On its final voyage, the Sewol was carrying more than twice its legal cargo limit. Containers were poorly secured. Ballast water, meant to keep the ship stable, had been drastically reduced to fit more freight. The ferry was a ticking time bomb. Then came the crew. Testimony revealed shocking negligence. When the ship began to list, passengers were ordered to remain in their cabins. Evacuation drills had never been properly conducted, and as chaos erupted, the crew saved themselves first. The most damning evidence was this. Captain Lee Jun-sok abandoned ship while wearing civilian clothes, disguising himself as a passenger. Survivors later recalled seeing him step onto a rescue boat as their classmates screamed for help inside. Public outrage exploded. Trials were convened in Gwangju District Court. Families packed the courtroom, clutching photos of their children, their faces etched with grief and rage. The captain stood accused of murder. Prosecutors argued that by failing to evacuate passengers and by abandoning them, he had effectively sentenced hundreds to death. Crew members faced charges of negligence and violation of maritime law. One by one, survivors testified. Students described following orders to stay put, waiting patiently for a rescue that never came. Parents spoke of final phone calls, of hearing their children's voices fade into silence. Divers recounted the horrors of retrieving bodies from flooded cabins. The courtroom fell silent as videos recorded by students inside the sinking ferry were played. Their trembling voices, their nervous laughter, their whispered goodbyes echoed through the chamber. It was undeniable proof of betrayal. In November 2014, the verdict came. Captain Lee Jun-sok was found guilty of gross negligence and sentenced to life imprisonment. 14 other crew members received prison terms ranging from 5 to 30 years. But justice felt incomplete. For the families, punishing the crew addressed only part of the truth. What about the shipping company that had overloaded the ferry? What about the regulators who had turned a blind eye? What about the Coast Guard that failed to mount a proper rescue? Further investigations revealed layers of corruption. Geun-hye Marine had deep political connections, shielding it from oversight. Safety inspections had been falsified, and when disaster struck, the Coast Guard's command structure collapsed, leaving civilian rescuers sidelined. Even the government came under fire. President Park Geun-hye was criticized for her slow and confused response. She had spent 7 hours unaccounted for during the critical window of the disaster. To this day, those missing hours remain a point of suspicion and outrage. The trials had delivered legal punishment. But for many South Koreans, true justice remained elusive. The Sewol tragedy was not just about one corrupt company or one cowardly captain. It was about a system built on negligence, complacency, and profit that had failed its children. And that failure demanded more than trials. It demanded change. The Sewol disaster was not only a maritime tragedy, it was a political earthquake. From the beginning, the government's response was slow, confused, and, at times, deceptive. Officials first claimed all passengers had been rescued. Later, they backtracked, admitting that hundreds were still trapped. Families who had clung to hope felt betrayed, lied to, abandoned. Anger boiled into the streets. Citizens marched with candles, demanding truth and accountability. Yellow ribbons, symbols of mourning, appeared everywhere. Tied to fences, pinned to jackets, hung in front of schools. The message was simple: remember the Sewol. Demand justice. But justice seemed far away. President Park Geun-hye quickly became the focus of outrage. On the day of the disaster, she disappeared from public view for nearly 7 hours, a void that has never been fully explained. Where was she while hundreds of teenagers drowned? What was she doing while families begged for help? Her eventual public statements, delivered stiffly in front of cameras, only deepened the anger. She promised reforms, vowed accountability, but for grieving parents, her words felt hollow. Protests grew louder. Families of victims traveled across the country, setting up tents in Seoul's Gwanghwamun Square. They held hunger strikes, carried portraits of their children, and demanded an independent investigation. But the government resisted. Proposals for a special inquiry were delayed, watered down, or blocked outright by political allies of the president. Each delay felt like another betrayal. Then new revelations emerged. Geun-hye Marine, the company that owned the Sewol, was linked to corruption and lax oversight. Regulators had approved unsafe modifications to the ship. Coast Guard officials had failed in their duty, and whispers suggested that high-level political connections had shielded these failures for years. For many South Koreans, the Sewol tragedy came to symbolize everything wrong with their system: corruption, negligence, and the callous indifference of those in power. By 2016, the anger ignited by Sewol had merged with another scandal: allegations of corruption and abuse of power, at the very heart of Park Geun-hye's presidency. Millions of South Koreans poured into the streets in what became the largest protests in the nation's history. Every Saturday, candlelight filled the avenues of Seoul. Protesters chanted not only against political corruption, but also against the failures that had left their children to die in the Sewol. The two causes became inseparable. In December 2016, The National Assembly voted to impeach President Park. By March 2017, the Constitutional Court upheld the decision, formally removing her from office. For the families of Sewol victims, her downfall was bittersweet. They had fought tirelessly for accountability. They had turned grief into activism, demanding that their children's deaths not be forgotten. And in many ways, they succeeded. But no impeachment could bring their children back. The Sewol disaster had changed South Korea forever. It exposed a system where profit outweighed safety, where bureaucracy strangled urgency, and where leaders could abandon the very people they swore to protect. More importantly, it gave birth to a new wave of civic activism. Ordinary citizens, teachers, parents, students, learned that their voices could topple even the highest office in the land. The yellow ribbon remained a constant reminder. Never forget, never forgive, never allow it to happen again. 3 years after the Sewol sank, the sea finally gave up its secret. In March 2017, an enormous salvage operation lifted the ferry from the seabed. For days, television cameras broadcast the haunting sight. The rusted, broken hull emerging from the water, dripping with seaweed and silence. Families watched from the shore, clutching yellow ribbons, hands trembling. For them, this was not just a ship. It was a tomb. Inside, they hoped to recover the last missing passengers, to finally lay their children to rest. Divers and investigators combed through the wreck. They recovered personal belongings, school uniforms, shoes, cell phones sealed in waterproof cases, still carrying unread messages. Each artifact was handled with reverence, as if the spirit of a child still clung to it. The recovery brought some closure, but it also reopened wounds. Seeing the Sewol again, scarred and lifeless, reminded the nation of every failure, every unanswered question. In the years that followed, reforms were promised. The South Korean Coast Guard, widely condemned for its inaction, was disbanded and later reorganized under stricter oversight. Safety regulations for passenger ships were tightened. Cargo limits were enforced. Evacuation drills became mandatory. Yet for many, change felt too slow, too shallow. Families argued that without deeper cultural reform, an end to corruption, cronyism, and blind obedience, the lessons of Sewol would fade. Every April 16th, South Korea mourns. Vigils are held across the country. In Ansan, where Danwon High School still stands, rows of yellow ribbons flutter in the wind. Classrooms remain empty, chairs left untouched, in memory of students who never returned. At the National Memorial in Ansan, photographs of the 250 students line the walls. Smiling faces in school uniforms, forever frozen at age 16 and 17. Visitors bow their heads, some in silence, others in tears. It is not only a place of grief, but also of resolve. For the families, activism has never ended. They continue to push for transparency, for independent investigations, for guarantees that no parent will ever again experience what they endured. Their struggle transforms South Korea's civic landscape, showing the power of ordinary citizens to demand accountability. The yellow ribbon has become a national symbol. It appears on buildings, buses, even in international events. simple in design, but heavy with meaning. Remember the Sewol. Remember the children. Remember the truth. Beyond South Korea, the tragedy stands as a global lesson. It warns of the deadly cost of negligence, of the dangers of blind obedience, and of the need for courage in the face of disaster. The Sewol story is not just about a ship sinking. It is about society itself, how it failed, how it mourned, and how it vowed to change. In total, 304 lives were lost. Most were young students, on what should have been the happiest trip of their school years. Their absence is felt in classrooms, in families, in communities across the nation. And so, each year, when April 16th arrives, South Korea remembers. Sirens ring, candles burn, parents whisper their children's names, and the nation recommits itself to the promise: never again. The Sewol lies silent now, dismantled after its recovery, but its memory sails on, etched into the conscience of a nation, carried in the yellow ribbons that flutter endlessly in the wind.